In the summer of 1942, the central sector of the Eastern Front became the scene of one of the most grueling operations of the war, Operation Seydlitz. To understand this campaign, it is necessary to consider the wider strategic context of the Rzhev salient, a protrusion of German-held territory west of Moscow that became known among Soviet soldiers as the Rzhev meat grinder. The salient extended deep into Soviet lines, anchored on the town of Rzhev, and defended by the German Ninth Army under General Walter Model. For both Hitler and Stalin, this area held strategic importance, as it controlled the approach to Moscow from the west and tied down vast numbers of troops that could not be deployed elsewhere. Following the failure of the German drive on Moscow in late 1941 and the Soviet counteroffensive during the winter of 1941-1942, the front stabilized along a broad arc stretching from Leningrad in the north to Kharkiv in the south. In the central sector, the Soviets had succeeded in creating several bridgeheads west of the Volga River, including deep penetrations into the German lines near Bely, Olenino, and Kolm. These pockets were the result of the Soviet winter counteroffensive, in which units of the Kalinin and Western fronts under Generals Ivan Konev and Georgy Zhukov had attempted to encircle and destroy German forces around Rzhev. The attacks had failed to achieve their ultimate aim, but they left behind several isolated Soviet formations that were supplied through narrow corridors or by air. By the spring of 1942, these Soviet forces represented both a threat and a liability. For the Red Army, they were forward positions that could be used to renew offensives toward Smolensk and Vitebsk. For the Germans, they were dangerous salients that threatened communications of the Ninth Army and had to be eliminated before the Soviets could mount another large-scale attack. The Wehrmacht High Command, OKH, therefore authorized a major operation to liquidate these pockets, codenamed Operation Seydlitz, named after the 18th century Prussian cavalry commander Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz. German preparations were extensive. The Ninth Army, numbering approximately 300,000 men, was reinforced with armored and motorized divisions, including the 1st, 2nd, and 5th Panzer Divisions, as well as strong artillery support. Luftwaffe units were allocated to provide close air support and to disrupt Soviet attempts at resupply. The Soviets, by contrast, had around 50,000 men trapped in the pockets, drawn primarily from the 39th Army and parts of the 22nd Army of the Kalinin Front. These troops were exhausted after months of combat in isolation, short on ammunition and food. The political context added further urgency. Stalin insisted that the Rzhev region remain an active front to prevent the Germans from shifting reserves to the south, where the Wehrmacht was preparing its summer offensive toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus. Soviet propaganda emphasized the determination of the troops fighting in the forests west of the Volga, portraying them as a spearhead of the coming liberation of occupied territory. For Hitler, on the other hand, the salient was essential for keeping pressure on Moscow and for securing a defensive anchor on the Central Front. He demanded that the Ninth Army hold its positions at all costs and destroy any Soviet units that threatened its rear. The stage was thus set for Operation Seydlitz, launched in early July 1942. It was conceived as a large-scale encirclement maneuver designed to cut off and annihilate the Soviet forces in the Bely and Olenino sectors. The Germans planned to use coordinated attacks from multiple directions, converging on the Soviet positions, sealing off escape routes, and then compressing the pockets with artillery and air bombardment. The operation represented both a tactical effort to secure the front and a symbolic assertion of German control in a sector where the Red Army had repeatedly sought to achieve breakthroughs. In this environment, the stakes were high for both sides. The Germans aimed to eliminate an estimated 10 Soviet rifle divisions and several tank brigades, thereby stabilizing the Rzhev sector and freeing troops for other operations. The Soviets, though outnumbered and surrounded, hoped to hold out long enough to tie down German forces and prevent them from being shifted to the decisive battles unfolding in the south. The preconditions of Operation Seydlitz thus reflected the broader dynamics of the Eastern Front in 1942, a war of attrition, maneuver, and competing priorities, where localized battles could have far-reaching consequences for the strategic balance. Operation Seydlitz began on 2 July 1942 with a massive German assault aimed at eliminating the Soviet forces that had remained behind the lines since the winter counteroffensive. The Ninth Army under General Walter Model opened the operation with coordinated thrusts from multiple directions designed to cut off the Soviet 39th Army and elements of the 22nd Army operating near Belly and Olenino. The offensive started with concentrated artillery barrages, followed by the advance of panzer and infantry divisions. German intelligence had estimated that the encircled Soviet group numbered between 40,000 and 50,000 men, supported by remnants. The opening moves focused on narrowing the supply corridors that linked the Soviet pockets to the rest of the Kalinin front. At Bailey, German armored spearheads of the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions pushed eastward, while infantry divisions pressed from the north and south. In parallel, the 5th Panzer Division advanced from the Olenino sector, aiming to close the gap behind the Soviet 39th Army. Within the first days of the offensive, the Germans succeeded in severing several of the narrow forest tracks and trails that had served as lifelines for Soviet supply. Luftwaffe units, including elements of the 8th Air Corps, bombed crossings and assembly areas, making resupply increasingly difficult. The Soviet command, under General Ivan Maslenikov of the Kalinin Front, reacted with attempts to hold open escape routes. Units of the 39th Army, numbering around 20,000 men at the beginning of July, dug in along defensive lines in the forests and marshes, using natural obstacles to slow German armor. Despite shortages of fuel and ammunition, they fought delaying actions, retreating gradually as the German pincers closed. The 22nd Army, positioned further north, attempted to counterattack to relieve pressure, but its forces were also under strain and could not achieve a breakthrough. Command decisions during this opening phase were critical. Model emphasized rapid encirclement, urging his panzer divisions to maintain speed and close the ring before the Soviets could withdraw. The German infantry followed to consolidate positions and prevent escapes. Soviet commanders, receiving orders from Stavka to hold their ground, resisted withdrawal until the situation became critical. This hesitation contributed to the rapid tightening of the German noose. By 6th of July, several Soviet regiments were already cut off in isolated forest clearings, fighting without hope of relief. On the ground, the intensity of combat was severe. German units advanced through dense forests and marshes, where visibility was limited and mechanized movement difficult. This terrain allowed Soviet defenders to stage ambushes, inflicting losses on German patrols and slowing progress. However, German superiority in artillery and air support gradually overcame these advantages. Luftwaffe bombers attacked suspected Soviet strongpoints, while heavy artillery barrages leveled villages and forest positions. Prisoners captured in the first days revealed the desperate state of Soviet supply. Rations had been cut to minimal levels, and ammunition stocks were critically low. The reaction of the German High Command to the early success was positive. Reports from the Ninth Army noted the encirclement was progressing faster than expected, with thousands of Soviet soldiers already surrendering or being captured in small groups. For the Soviets, the opening of Operation Seydlitz signaled disaster. Communications with surrounded units became sporadic, and efforts to send reinforcements from the main front lines met with heavy resistance from German blocking positions. The Stavka instructed commanders to maintain resistance in place to tie down German forces, but this order effectively condemned many Soviet units to encirclement. By the end of the first week of July, the outlines of the German encirclement were firmly established. The Soviet 39th Army was compressed into an ever-shrinking area west of the Volga, while units of the 22nd Army were cut off near Olenino. German estimates suggested that as many as 30,000 Soviet soldiers were now trapped. Although many fought on in isolated groups, the opening phase of Operation Seydlitz had achieved its primary objective, the separation of the Soviet pocket from external relief and the beginning of systematic liquidation. This initial success set the stage for the next phase of the operation, in which German forces would attempt to annihilate the encircled armies through a combination of bombardment, ground assault, and psychological pressure. The strategic goals of Operation Seydlitz were shaped both by the German need to secure the Rzhev salient and by the Soviet determination to maintain pressure on the central sector of the front. For the German High Command, the salient served as a forward bastion, projecting deep into Soviet lines and threatening Moscow's approaches from the west. At the same time, it tied down large German formations that could otherwise have been used in the summer offensive toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus. General Walter Model's Ninth Army, with approximately 300,000 men, held the salient, but it was threatened by Soviet bridgeheads that had been maintained since the winter battles of 1941 to 1942. The most prominent of these was the pocket formed by the 39th Army and parts of the 22nd Army in the forests near Bely and Olenino. For the Germans, the strategic objective of Seydlitz was to eliminate these Soviet footholds, thereby stabilizing the central front and freeing units for redeployment. Model planned to encircle and annihilate the Soviet 39th Army, estimated at 25,000 men, and the elements of the 22nd Army that had pushed into the salient. The liquidation of these forces would reduce Soviet offensive potential in the sector and secure vital rail lines running through Smolensk and Vyazma, which were lifelines for German supply. The Ninth Army's operations relied heavily on mobility, with panzer divisions tasked to slice through Soviet defenses and close the encirclement, while infantry divisions tightened the ring and cleared forested areas. The logistical preparations for the operation reflected its importance. German engineers repaired roads and bridges in the heavily wooded region to enable the movement of tanks and artillery. Ammunition and fuel dumps were stockpiled close to the front to sustain several weeks of heavy fighting. The Luftwaffe allocated dive bomber units and reconnaissance squadrons specifically for Seydlitz, ensuring air superiority over the battlefield. The aim was not only to destroy Soviet forces, but to do so quickly, minimizing the time and resources consumed in the operation. On the Soviet side, the strategic goals were far less clear, in part because of the precarious position of the encircled armies. The 39th Army, commanded by General Ivan Zakharkin, and the 22nd Army, under General Rzhev, had been ordered by Stavka to maintain their bridgeheads west of the Volga and use them as springboards for renewed offensives toward Smolensk. However, by mid-1942, these forces were exhausted, undersupplied, and vulnerable. Their supply lines consisted of narrow forest corridors, constantly threatened by German attacks, and resupply by air could not compensate for the shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Despite this, the Soviet High Command insisted on holding these positions. Politically, abandoning the salient was unthinkable. Stalin demanded constant pressure on the Germans in the central sector to prevent them from shifting forces south to the Stalingrad front. Propaganda celebrated the defenders of the Rzhev pockets as symbols of resilience, portraying them as a thorn in the side of the German occupation. Militarily, however, the Soviets underestimated the speed and intensity of the German offensive that was being prepared against them. There were also miscalculations in Soviet planning. Stavka believed that the isolated armies could be reinforced in time if the Germans launched a major attack. In practice, attempts to send reinforcements from the main front through the forests met with strong German blocking forces. Soviet intelligence did not fully anticipate the scale of Model's preparations, including the concentration of 3 panzer divisions for the encirclement. As a result, when Operation Seydlitz began, The Soviet forces inside the pockets were caught in positions too far forward, with no prepared fallback lines and inadequate supplies for prolonged defense. Both sides made use of propaganda to bolster morale. German communiques emphasized the operation as a decisive blow that would secure the central sector once and for all. Soviet broadcasts, meanwhile, lauded the heroism of the trapped armies and urged them to resist to the last man. Leaflets were dropped over Soviet positions, offering honorable surrender, while Soviet political officers distributed orders forbidding withdrawal and insisting on continued resistance. The clash of doctrines, German reliance on swift encirclement and destruction versus Soviet emphasis on endurance and sacrifice, set the stage for a brutal confrontation in the forests and swamps around Belly. Thus, the strategic planning phase of Operation Seydlitz highlighted the fundamental imbalance between the two sides. The Germans had clear objectives, strong logistical preparation, and overwhelming local superiority, while the Soviets were constrained by political directives, inadequate supplies, and vulnerable positions. The outcome of this planning became evident in July 19. The miscalculations of the Soviet High Command and the precision of German planning combined to create the conditions for one of the largest encirclements of the Rzhev battles. The first engagements of Operation Seydlitz unfolded in the first week of July 1942 as the German Ninth Army pressed its offensive into the forests and swamps west of Rzhev. The operation began with concentrated artillery barrages delivered by more than 600 German guns and mortars, targeting known Soviet defensive positions along the narrow supply corridors linking the pockets to the main Soviet front. Immediately afterward, Panzer Division struck forward, spearheaded by the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions near Bailey and the 5th Panzer Division advancing from Olenino. Their task was to slice through the flanks of the Soviet 39th Army and rapidly link up behind its positions, completing an encirclement. For the Soviets, the first days of battle were marked by confusion and desperation. The 39th Army, already weakened by months of attritional fighting, had about 20,000 to 25,000 troops in the salient. They were deployed in thinly spread formations, relying on forests and marshes for concealment, but lacking solid defensive fortifications. The Germans exploited this weakness, advancing quickly along forest tracks, with the aid of engineers who cleared obstacles and repaired bridges. The Luftwaffe maintained constant aerial pressure, with Ju-87 dive bombers attacking Soviet positions and disrupting attempts to move reserves. By 6 July, German armored thrusts had penetrated deeply into the Soviet rear. Reports from German Corps headquarters noted that resistance was fragmented, with Soviet units retreating into small forest strongholds rather than coordinated defensive lines. The Soviets attempted several counterattacks using remnants of tank brigades, but fuel shortages. At one point, a Soviet force of about 30 tanks counterattacked near the village of Pushkari, but German anti-tank units and airstrikes destroyed most of them, leaving the counterattack broken. Territorial shifts came quickly. The German pincer movements narrowed the Soviet supply corridors to a few kilometers across. In the Belly sector, the 1st Panzer Division advanced more than 15 kilometers in 3 days, linking with infantry divisions moving from the south. At Olenino, the 5th Panzer Division closed on Soviet positions, forcing elements of the 22nd Army into retreat. By 9 July, the German pincers had effectively closed, trapping tens of thousands of Soviet troops inside the forested pocket. The civilian population of the region faced immediate consequences. Villages in the path of the offensive were destroyed by shelling and airstrikes, and survivors fled into forests or were driven out by German troops. Local peasants, caught between advancing German units and retreating Soviet forces, faced requisitions of food and forced labor. Some attempted to aid the Soviet troops with food and guidance, but German countermeasures, including reprisals, quickly curtailed this support. Civilians became unwilling participants in the encirclement, with many perishing during bombardments or forced evacuations. Morale on both sides shifted during these first engagements. German troops, buoyed by rapid progress, reported high confidence in their commander's encirclement strategy. For the Soviets, Morale was strained by the realization that their escape routes were closing. Political officers distributed orders to hold positions at all costs, while Stavka broadcasts emphasized the symbolic importance of resistance. Yet soldiers facing dwindling ammunition and food supplies understood the gravity of their situation. Accounts from captured prisoners revealed despair among units that had been fighting in isolation since the winter, with many recognizing that relief was unlikely. Unexpected outcomes also began to shape the encirclement. German units advancing through forests found the terrain difficult for tanks, with vehicles frequently bogged down or vulnerable to ambushes. Soviet defenders exploited this with small groups armed with anti-tank rifles and mines, inflicting casualties and slowing progress. In one instance, a German panzer battalion lost over a dozen vehicles to hidden Soviet anti-tank positions before artillery cleared the defenders. These localized Soviet successes delayed the tightening of the German ring and allowed some Soviet groups to escape temporarily through the woods. Despite these isolated actions, the overall German momentum proved decisive. By mid-July, the thousands of Soviet soldiers were trapped in scattered forest positions, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. German forces began systematic reduction of the pockets, using artillery bombardment followed by infantry assaults. Prisoners taken in these early actions reported starvation rations, with some Soviet soldiers reduced to half portions of bread per day and little ammunition for their rifles. Thus, the first engagements of Operation Seydlitz confirmed the accuracy of German planning. The Soviet pockets, remnants of the winter counteroffensive, were now compressed and facing destruction. The territorial shifts in the first week transformed the battlefield, from tenuous Soviet salients into isolated cauldrons, surrounded by German divisions determined to liquidate them. The initial clashes demonstrated the vulnerability of exhausted Soviet armies when confronted by concentrated German firepower. As Operation Seydlitz entered its second week in July 1942, the battle escalated into a full-scale crisis for the Soviet forces trapped west of Rzhev. The initial German encirclement had been achieved, but eliminating the surrounded Soviet 39th Army and elements of the 22nd Army required relentless pressure and systematic reduction of their positions. For the Soviet soldiers inside the pocket, the situation grew dire with each passing day as shortages of food, water, and ammunition worsened, and the possibility of relief diminished. For the Germans, the task was equally demanding, requiring the coordination of multiple divisions in dense forests and swamps, where supply lines stretched thin and partisan activity threatened rear areas. The Ninth Army's strategy during this stage emphasized constant attack to prevent the Soviets from regrouping or breaking out. General Walter Model ordered his panzer divisions to continue pushing through the forest, isolating Soviet strongpoints into smaller cauldrons, while infantry and artillery destroyed them one by one. Heavy artillery barrages preceded infantry assaults, and the Luftwaffe bombed suspected Soviet concentrations daily. German units reported capturing thousands of prisoners in small groups, often starving and exhausted, unable to maintain organized resistance. By mid-July, German estimates suggested that as many as 25,000 Soviet troops were surrounded, with the remnants of the 39th Army compressed into a shrinking area. The Soviet command faced a desperate dilemma. Stavka had ordered the trapped armies to hold their positions to tie down German forces and prevent their redeployment southward. Yet the encircled troops had little hope of receiving significant reinforcements. Attempts by neighboring Soviet units to relieve the pockets failed. The Kalinin front launched attacks from outside the encirclement to break open corridors, but these were repelled by German blocking forces. In one case, the Soviet 30th Army attempted to push from the north, but German infantry and tanks repelled the assault with heavy losses. The inability to re-establish supply routes condemned the encircled armies to attrition. Inside the pocket, the challenges were immense. Soviet soldiers were reduced to eating whatever they could forage in the forests, and medical supplies were virtually non-existent. Wounded men often died untreated, while ammunition shortages forced units to conserve fire or engage in close combat. The political leadership inside the pocket, led by commissars, demanded continued resistance, reading out orders forbidding surrender. While some units obeyed, others attempted breakout attempts in small groups. Many of these efforts ended in disaster, as German patrols intercepted fleeing soldiers. Prisoners reported that those caught often had only a few cartridges left, with no food for days. For the Germans, the liquidation of the pocket was not without cost. Combat in the dense forests was slow and exhausting. Tanks frequently bogged down in marshy terrain, and Soviet ambushes inflicted casualties on German patrols. In several engagements, Soviet defenders armed with anti-tank rifles knocked out advancing German vehicles, delaying progress. German casualty reports for the Ninth Army during Operation Seydlitz recorded several thousand killed and wounded by the end of July, reflecting the difficulty of forest fighting despite overwhelming superiority. Nevertheless, the systematic approach of isolating, bombarding, and storming Soviet positions gradually wore down resistance. The human cost mounted rapidly. By 12th of July, German reports indicated that more than 20,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed or captured. Entire regiments were destroyed, with surviving groups reduced to company or platoon strength. The 39th Army, which had once been a major formation, ceased to exist as a coherent force. The 22nd Army elements fared little better, suffering heavy casualties in failed breakout attempts. The scale of Soviet losses was catastrophic compared to the relatively limited German casualties, underlining the imbalance in resources and preparation. The escalation of the battle also had political ramifications. Soviet propaganda continued to portray the defenders as heroes, emphasizing their determination to resist encirclement. Pravda and other publications claimed that the pocket tied down several German divisions, preventing them from moving south. German communiques, by contrast, both sides thus used the battle to bolster morale, though the reality for the men inside the pocket was one of starvation, exhaustion, and imminent defeat. International observers paid little immediate attention to Seydlitz, overshadowed as it was by simultaneous operations in the south, particularly the German advance towards Stalingrad. Yet within the central sector of the front, the liquidation of the Soviet pockets at Rzhev was a critical development. It stabilized the German Ninth Army's positions and removed the immediate Soviet threat west of the Volga. At the same time, the cost in manpower and the brutality of the fighting foreshadowed the continuing attrition that would define the Rzhev battles through 1943. By the third week of July 1942, the crisis for the escalation of Operation Seydlitz thus transformed the Soviet bridgeheads from potential springboards for offensives into killing grounds where entire armies were destroyed. For the men of the 39th and 22nd Armies, the crisis phase meant the end of organized resistance, with only scattered groups left to fight on in isolated forest pockets. The stage was set for the final liquidation that would follow in the peak phase of the campaign. By mid-July 1942, Operation Seydlitz had reached its peak intensity. The German Ninth Army pressed the encirclement to its conclusion, while the remnants of the Soviet 39th and 22nd Armies fought desperately to survive. The battlefield, centered on the heavily forested region near Bely and Olenino, became a scene of systematic destruction as German forces reduced the pockets step by step. German command decisions during this phase emphasized the need for swift annihilation. General Walter Model ordered continuous assaults, seeking to avoid any possibility that Soviet units might break through or prolong resistance. Panzer divisions completed the encirclement ring, while infantry and artillery tightened it daily. Heavy artillery units, including 210mm howitzers and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, were employed to smash forest strongpoints. The Luftwaffe intensified its role, flying hundreds of sorties per day to bomb suspected concentrations and interdict escape attempts. Coordination between ground and air units ensured that any detected Soviet movement was met with overwhelming firepower. The Soviet side was collapsing under the weight of these attacks. The 39th Army, which had numbered around 20,000 to 25,000. The 22nd Army, trapped further north, suffered similar devastation. Attempts to organize counterattacks failed, as units often had only a fraction of their authorized strength and little or no artillery support. Ammunition shortages were crippling. In some regiments, soldiers were left with fewer than 10 cartridges per rifle. Communications between command posts and subordinate units broke down, leaving many groups without orders. German reports from 15-20 July recorded large numbers of prisoners taken daily. In one sweep near Belly, over 5,000 Soviet soldiers surrendered after running out of food and ammunition. Another 3,000 were captured in the Olenino sector after failed breakout attempts. Yet not all surrendered. Many Soviet groups chose to fight to the last, often in small forest clearings surrounded by German artillery. German infantry units reported having to storm dug-in bunkers at close range, suffering casualties despite overwhelming superiority. These clashes slowed progress but could not alter the outcome. The civilian population endured enormous hardship during this peak phase. Villages caught in the fighting were burned during bombardments, and inhabitants were either evacuated, killed, or driven into the forests. German forces carried out reprisals against communities suspected of aiding Soviet troops, while Soviet soldiers themselves requisitioned food and shelter when possible. Thousands of civilians fled eastward, but many were trapped in the encircled zone, sharing the fate of the soldiers. Testimonies collected after the war described families hiding in forests for weeks, starving and exposed as battles raged around them. Losses mounted rapidly on both sides. By late July, German claims listed more than 30,000 Soviet prisoners, along with hundreds of captured guns and vehicles. Soviet archival data later confirmed that the 39th Army ceased to exist as a fighting force, with only fragments managing to break out or evade capture. The 22nd Army was similarly shattered, losing much of its manpower. German casualties, though much lower in comparison, were still significant. Reports indicated that the 9th Army suffered over 9,000 killed and wounded during Operation Seydlitz, reflecting the intensity of combat in the forest where Soviet resistance remained fierce despite hopeless circumstances. At the height of the campaign, the psychological toll was evident. German soldiers, though confident in victory, grew weary of the relentless forest fighting, which demanded close-quarters assaults and constant vigilance against ambushes. For the Soviets, morale was near collapse. Starvation, exhaustion, and the destruction of units eroded discipline. Desertions increased, though escape was nearly impossible. Still, political officers urged resistance, reminding soldiers that their sacrifice tied down German divisions that could otherwise reinforce the southern front. The outcome of the peak phase was decisive. By 23 July, German forces had broken up the last organized formations of the 39th Army, while mopping-up operations continued against scattered groups. The forested battlefield was littered with destroyed equipment, burned villages, and the bodies of thousands of soldiers. The 9th Army declared Operation Seydlitz a success, having eliminated the Soviet threat in the Rzhev sector. For the Red Army, the destruction was catastrophic. Entire divisions were wiped out, and tens of thousands of men were dead or captured. Yet even in defeat, the stubborn resistance of the trapped armies fulfilled part of their purpose. German 9th Army divisions had been tied down for nearly a month. The peak of Seydlitz therefore represented both a German tactical success and a Soviet strategic sacrifice, one that revealed the brutal arithmetic of attrition in the Rzhev battles. After the destruction of the main Soviet formations inside the Belly-Olenino salient, Operation Seydlitz entered a phase of resistance and adaptation. Though the bulk of the 39th Army and elements of the 22nd Army had been eliminated as coherent fighting forces, significant groups of Soviet soldiers continued to resist in the forests and swamps. These scattered detachments, numbering in the hundreds or sometimes a few thousand, attempted to evade capture, regroup, and even stage limited counterattacks. For the Germans, what had seemed like a completed encirclement now evolved into weeks of clearing operations that demanded extensive manpower and resources. Soviet survivors of the encirclement relied on improvisation. Cut off from supply lines and abandoned by organized logistics, they lived off the land, foraging for food in forests and fields. Ammunition shortages forced them to conserve every cartridge, and weapons were scavenged from fallen comrades or captured from the enemy. Commanders who survived the initial collapse tried to reorganize remnants into partisan-style groups, focusing on harassment of German patrols rather than conventional defense. Some detachments attempted to re-establish contact with Soviet lines to the east, navigating through forests at night to avoid German patrols. A few succeeded, bringing back reports of the disaster that had befallen the 39th Army. German forces responded with systematic sweeps, supported by artillery and air reconnaissance. Infantry regiments advanced through forest sectors in coordinated grids, flushing out stragglers and destroying camps. The Ninth Army deployed specialist units with armored vehicles were used on forest roads to seal off possible escape routes. Despite these efforts, the dense terrain allowed many Soviet soldiers to remain hidden for weeks. Small firefights erupted regularly as isolated groups fought to the last or attempted desperate breakouts. In some cases, German units reported losing dozens of men in ambushes staged by groups no larger than a company. The adaptation of Soviet survivors to partisan warfare during this stage was significant. Many who escaped capture later joined organized partisan brigades operating in the Kalinin and Smolensk regions. They carried with them the experience of the encirclement, which reinforced the importance of mobility, concealment, and reliance on local civilian support. Civilians, despite the dangers of reprisals, often provided food and shelter to the fugitives. German countermeasures were harsh, with reprisals against villages suspected of aiding Soviet soldiers. Entire communities were burned, and inhabitants deported or executed. This cycle of repression and resistance intensified the partisan war in the region, which continued long after the formal end of Operation Seydlitz. Psychologically, both sides endured heavy strain during this stage. German soldiers found the clearing operations exhausting and demoralizing. Fighting an enemy who appeared suddenly out of the forest and disappeared just as quickly created constant tension. Casualties, while smaller than in the peak battles, continued to mount steadily. Reports from German divisions noted growing fatigue, with troops engaged in nearly continuous patrols, sweeps, and close combat in difficult terrain. For the Soviet survivors, the psychological toll of isolation, hunger, and the loss of comrades was immense. Yet the determination to resist, instilled by commissars and reinforced by propaganda. Resource management was another critical factor. German supply lines, already stretched by the demands of the Eastern Front, had to sustain weeks of mopping up operations in terrain that limited vehicle movement. Infantry carried rations and ammunition on foot, supported by horse-drawn carts. Soviet survivors, by contrast, adapted by raiding German supply convoys or seizing food from villages. Improvisation extended to weaponry. Soviet groups repaired damaged rifles, used captured German grenades, and even fashioned makeshift explosives. The resourcefulness displayed in these conditions foreshadowed the development of more organized partisan tactics in later years. Despite the overwhelming German superiority, resistance persisted well into late July and early August. Official German communiques reported the capture of tens of thousands of prisoners, but behind these statistics lay the reality of continuous skirmishing. Soviet remnants that could not escape eastward melted into the forests, forming the nucleus of partisan bands that would harass German communications throughout 1942-1943. Thus, while Operation Seydlitz succeeded in eliminating 2 Soviet armies, it also inadvertently contributed to the strengthening of the partisan war in the central sector. By early August 1942, the adaptation phase was drawing to a close. The bulk of Soviet organized resistance in the salient had been crushed, but German reports acknowledged that scattered groups remained at large. These remnants no longer posed a strategic threat, but forced the Ninth Army to divert troops to rear security duties, weakening its ability to redeploy forces to other fronts. The Soviet capacity for conventional defense in the Rzhev sector was broken, yet the persistence of survivors demonstrated the Red Army's ability to. The resistance and adaptation that followed the main encirclement highlighted the brutal reality of the Rzhev battles. Even after decisive defeats, the conflict did not end. Instead, it shifted into a grinding war of attrition and irregular warfare, leaving a lasting imprint on soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike. Operation Seydlitz was not merely a clean liquidation of Soviet forces, but a prolonged struggle in which adaptation, endurance, and the will to resist shaped the aftermath. The turning point of Operation Seydlitz came in the final 10 days of July 1942, when the last organized Soviet resistance within the Rzhev salient collapsed. Until this stage, Soviet remnants had continued to fight in scattered groups, but as German forces tightened the encirclement ring, the balance shifted decisively. What had once been armies capable of launching offensives for the Germans, the turning point meant that their strategy of encirclement and destruction had achieved its aim. For the Soviets, it marked the annihilation of two armies and the permanent loss of a foothold west of the Volga in this sector. The decisive German action occurred between 20 and 25 July. The Ninth Army intensified its sweep through the forests, employing concentrated artillery bombardments, followed by infantry advances to compress the remaining pockets. German engineers cleared paths through marshland, sealing escape routes and cutting off the last supply tracks. The Luftwaffe maintained constant surveillance from the air, directing strikes against any signs of Soviet concentration. By 23 July, German units reported that large-scale organized resistance had ceased. Captured Soviet commanders admitted that they could no longer coordinate defense, as communications had been severed and units had dwindled to a fraction of their strength. The collapse of Soviet resistance was accelerated by failed breakout attempts. In mid-July, elements of the 22nd Army attempted to fight eastward toward Soviet lines. Approximately 5,000 men assembled for the effort, but they encountered prepared German blocking positions supported by armor and artillery. After several days of fighting, only a small fraction escaped, while thousands were killed or captured. Another breakout by remnants of the 39th Army near Bely ended in disaster when German patrols encircled the column in open ground. Prisoner interrogations revealed that many soldiers had marched with only a handful of cartridges each, lacking food and water. These failed attempts convinced many remaining groups that surrender or death were the only outcomes left. German casualty reports illustrate the ferocity of this final phase. Between 15 and 25 July, the Ninth Army reported nearly 4,000 additional casualties, reflecting the stubbornness of Soviet resistance even as their situation became hopeless. German infantry frequently had to storm forest bunkers and fortified clearings, suffering losses at close range. Yet the overall trajectory was unmistakable. Soviet units no longer had the strength to mount coordinated counterattacks, and their numerical inferiority, reduced from more than 40,000 men at the start of the operation to scattered survivors numbering in the thousands, ensured their defeat. For civilians trapped in the encircled zone, the turning point was catastrophic. With villages destroyed, crops requisitioned, and livestock seized, starvation set in. Many peasants fled into forests, only to be caught in the crossfire between German sweeps and Soviet remnants. Entire communities were deported or destroyed in reprisals, suspected of aiding Soviet troops. The humanitarian toll, while less documented than the military losses, was immense and added to the suffering that defined the Rzhev battles as a whole. The psychological repercussions were profound. German soldiers, witnessing the annihilation of large Soviet formations, felt confidence in the tactical soundness of encirclement warfare. For the Soviets, the destruction of the 39th and 22nd Armies became a bitter lesson in the risks of maintaining salients without secure supply lines. Survivors who escaped eastward carried stories of devastation, which underscored to the Soviet command the need for more cautious planning in future operations. The turning point also had operational implications beyond the Rzhev sector. By late July, with the pockets eliminated, the Ninth Army declared the Central Front stabilized. This allowed German High Command to consider transferring divisions south to reinforce. Although the timetable was too tight to have a decisive impact there, the liquidation of the Rzhev pockets removed a major concern for the Wehrmacht's Central Front and allowed Model to fortify the salient for the coming months. For the Soviet Union, the collapse of the salient was a blow to morale, but not the end of operations in the region. Stavka quickly began planning new offensives against the Rzhev sector, determined to prevent the Germans from consolidating their hold. Even as the last Soviet troops were being destroyed in Operation Seydlitz, preparations were underway for further attacks later in 1942, reflecting the determination to keep pressure on the Germans regardless of losses. Thus, the turning point of Operation Seydlitz was not a single battle, but the cumulative effect of encirclement, attrition, and failed breakout attempts. By late July, the Soviet presence the Ninth Army's encirclement tactics had succeeded, but the resources consumed and the brutality of the fighting foreshadowed the grinding stalemate that would define the Rzhev front for another year. The liquidation of the pockets was a tactical German victory and a Soviet disaster, yet its long-term consequences would prove more complex, as both sides drew lessons that shaped the next stages of the war. By the end of July 1942, Operation Seydlitz transitioned into its final stage, the systematic liquidation of the remaining Soviet troops and the winding down of combat operations. The Ninth Army announced the destruction of the Soviet 39th and 22nd Armies as organized formations, but mopping up actions continued into early August. German divisions swept through forests and marshes, capturing stragglers and breaking up small groups of defenders. For the Soviets, this period was defined by desperation, as isolated soldiers struggled to evade capture or attempted hopeless last stands. The end of the operation unfolded with grim efficiency. German infantry divisions carried out clearing belts, advancing line by line through the forests, supported by artillery fire that destroyed suspected shelters and bunkers. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft located movement in clearings or along streams, directing dive bombers to strike. Units of the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions, having completed their encirclement tasks, now sealed off escape routes and guarded roads, preventing fugitives from reaching Soviet lines. Prisoners were taken in large numbers. By the first week of August, German reports claimed that more than 50,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed or captured in the course of Operation Seydlitz. For the Soviet forces trapped in the salient, the final phase was catastrophic. The 39th Army, which had once numbered around 25,000 men in this sector, ceased to exist entirely. Its divisions were annihilated or dissolved into small groups of fugitives. The 22nd Army, already weakened before the operation, was similarly shattered. Only a few thousand men managed to break through German lines in scattered groups, and even these survivors often arrived without heavy weapons or equipment. Soviet attempts to relieve the encircled forces had failed completely, leaving the trapped troops with no hope of organized escape. The humanitarian consequences were equally severe. Civilians caught inside the encirclement faced starvation, deportation, or death. German occupation authorities imposed collective punishments on villages suspected of sheltering Soviet soldiers, burning homes, and executing inhabitants. In some cases, Soviet soldiers and civilians fled together, trying to reach partisan-controlled areas deeper in the forests. These escapes were perilous, with German patrols hunting fugitives and reprisals taken against anyone who helped them. German losses in the aftermath phase were relatively moderate compared to the Soviet catastrophe, but not insignificant. The Ninth Army reported more than 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing during the course of the operation, reflecting the intensity of forest fighting and the determination of Soviet resistance even in hopeless circumstances. Equipment losses included tanks destroyed by ambushes in the forests, as well as vehicles disabled by terrain and mines. Still, the overall German assessment of the operation was positive. The elimination of 2 Soviet armies had stabilized the central sector. The Red Army lost not only tens of thousands of men, but also valuable equipment, artillery, and armor. The elimination of the 39th and 22nd Armies weakened the Kalinin front and deprived Stavka of formations it had hoped to use for further offensives toward Smolensk. The morale of surviving troops was severely affected, as the disaster at Rzhev revealed the risks of maintaining isolated salients without adequate supply and reinforcement. The political consequences followed quickly. Soviet propaganda shifted its tone, downplaying the scale of the losses in the Rzhev sector while emphasizing the valor of the defenders. Official communiqué claimed that their sacrifice had tied down large German forces, preventing them from reinforcing the offensive in the south. While this contained some truth, the Ninth Army was indeed fully committed to Seydlitz during July. The enormous losses undermined Soviet credibility in the region. Within the Red Army, commanders analyzed the failure, concluding that overextension and inadequate supply lines had made the disaster inevitable once the Germans launched their operation. German occupation forces consolidated their hold on the Rzhev sector in the weeks after Seydlitz. Villages were fortified, roads secured, and supply lines restored. The salient itself, though stabilized, remained a vulnerable projection into Soviet territory, requiring heavy garrisons. The Ninth Army remained tied down, defending Rzhev and Vyazma, limiting the possibility of transferring troops to other fronts. Thus, while Seydlitz was a tactical success, it also reinforced the long-term burden of holding the salient against continued Soviet attacks. By early August 1942, Operation Seydlitz was officially concluded. The Soviet bridgeheads west of the Volga in this sector had been eliminated, the Red Army had lost tens of thousands of soldiers, and the German Ninth Army could claim one of its most decisive victories in the Central Front. Yet the aftermath revealed deeper truths about the conflict. The Soviets had demonstrated their ability to endure catastrophic losses and continue fighting, while the Germans had once again consumed valuable manpower in battles that did not bring them closer to strategic victory. The liquidation of the Soviet pockets brought temporary relief to the Wehrmacht, but it foreshadowed the grinding attrition that would define the Rzhev front through the next year. The legacy of Operation Seydlitz was shaped both by its immediate tactical outcomes and by the broader historical debates that emerged in the decades after the war. In July 1942, the German Ninth Army under General Walter Model succeeded in achieving one of the Wehrmacht's most complete local victories of the Rzhev campaign. Two Soviet armies, the 39th and much of the 22nd, were destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. German reports claimed more than 50,000 prisoners taken and tens of thousands more Soviet soldiers killed. Large amounts of equipment, artillery, and vehicles were seized or destroyed. For the Wehrmacht, Operation Seydlitz was seen at the time as proof that disciplined encirclement operations could still deliver decisive results on the Eastern Front. Yet the long-term consequences were far more complex. While the immediate liquidation of the Soviet pockets relieved pressure on the central sector, the strategic effect was limited. The Rzhev salient itself remained intact but vulnerable. The Germans were forced to garrison the salient with large numbers of troops to prevent further Soviet penetrations, tying down divisions that could not be redeployed to other fronts. Instead of liberating resources for the decisive offensives toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus, Seydlitz bound the Ninth Army even more tightly to the Central Front. The salient became a long-term liability, absorbing German manpower and resources until the eventual withdrawal in March 1943. For the Soviet Union, the losses at Rzhev were staggering. Entire formations disappeared, their men killed, captured, or scattered into partisan bands. The 39th Army was effectively destroyed as an operational unit. The cost in lives and equipment was immense, but the Soviet state absorbed the blow and prepared new offensives. Within weeks of Seydlitz's conclusion, Stavka was already planning renewed operations in the Rzhev sector, determined to keep pressure on the Germans. This ability to recover quickly from catastrophic defeats underscored one of the defining characteristics of the Red Army in 1942-1943, resilience rooted in mass mobilization and political determination. The long-term political and cultural significance of Seydlitz also emerged in how it was remembered. German wartime propaganda celebrated the operation as a major success, presenting it as evidence that Soviet offensives were futile and that German encirclement tactics retained their effectiveness. Soviet wartime propaganda, by contrast, minimized the scale of the disaster, focusing instead on the heroism of the trapped armies and portraying their resistance as having delayed and tied down German divisions. In post-war Soviet historiography, the losses in the Rzhev battles were acknowledged only partially. The term Rzhev meat grinder entered popular memory, encapsulating the enormous human cost of operations in this region. Historians after the war debated the significance of Operation Seydlitz. Some emphasized its role as a textbook example of German encirclement warfare, demonstrating the tactical skill of commanders like Model. Others highlighted its limited strategic effect, noting that it did not alter the overall trajectory of the war in 1942. At the same time, scholars analyzing Soviet sources stressed the sacrifices made by the Red Army in holding the Rzhev sector, arguing that these operations, though costly, contributed indirectly to the eventual Soviet victory by draining German strength and preventing reinforcements from reaching more decisive fronts such as Stalingrad. The operation also influenced the development. Many of the Soviet soldiers who escaped encirclement during Seydlitz joined partisan groups in the forests of the Kalinin and Smolensk regions. Their combat experience and knowledge of German tactics strengthened the partisan movement, which grew in effectiveness throughout late 1942 and 1943. In this way, the liquidation of the Soviet armies paradoxically contributed to the rise of a different form of resistance that continued to harass German supply lines and rear areas. In military terms, the legacy of Seydlitz lay in its lessons about attrition and the costs of maintaining salience. For the Germans, the operation confirmed that they could still achieve operational victories, but revealed the unsustainable burden of defending extended positions deep inside enemy territory. For the Soviets, the disaster underscored the risks of holding salience without secure. German high command became increasingly cautious about committing large forces to encirclements in forested or marshy terrain, while the Red Army adjusted its doctrine to emphasize deeper preparation and logistical support for offensives. Today, Operation Seydlitz is remembered as part of the larger Rzhev campaign, one of the most brutal and costly series of battles of the Eastern Front. While overshadowed in public memory by Stalingrad and Kursk, the fighting at Rzhev claimed hundreds of thousands of lives over 2 years and played a central role in wearing down German forces. Seydlitz, though successful in its immediate aims, is now viewed as a tactical victory with limited strategic value, emblematic of the grinding attrition that defined the war in the central sector. Its historical significance lies in the human cost, the lessons learned, and its role in shaping the broader narrative of the Eastern Front as a war of annihilation and endurance. Thus, the liquidation of the Soviet pockets at Rzhev in 1942 was more than a local battle. It was a microcosm of the wider struggle, German tactical brilliance confronting Soviet numerical resilience, both sides suffering enormous casualties, and civilians caught in the devastation. Operation Seydlitz closed one chapter in the Rzhev battles, but left behind a legacy of sacrifice, destruction, and strategic ambiguity that continues to occupy historians and memory alike.